Nick Cave was born in Fulton, Missouri in the year 1959. He received his BFA at the Kansas City Art Institute in 1982, attended the University of North Texas, and later on received his MFA at the Cranbrook Academy of Art in 1989. Cave made his first soundsuit sculpture in 1991 after the infamous Rodney King beatings in Los Angeles. He made the sculptural body forms as a second skin to obscure the themes of gender, race, and class. He also has explored using found objects, connecting his work back to the society in which we live, and using these items that have been discarded and giving them a new life. Other themes that Nick Cave hits on throughout his work, besides gender, race, and class, is social and political events, the idea of identity, and space, which is what we will be focusing on within our installation piece that we chose. Nick Cave is seen as a sculptor, dancer, and performance artist. He oftentimes combines these three aspects of his art and identity through installation and exhibitions. An installation that we chose for this project is called Sojourn, which literally means temporary stay, which is kind of the overarching theme and idea behind how Nick Cave displayed his work. The exhibition happened at the Denver Art Museum in the year 2013 during the span of June 9th through September 22nd. The Sojourn installation features 5 areas of the exhibit. There are button sculptures at the beginning that are supposed to transcend the viewer into this otherworldly space that Cave has meticulously created through not only his sculptures but the actual layout that you walk through. There's then an area of found object sculptures, which hits on the idea of loyalty, the role of dogs, and the relationship with humans, and this kind of juxtaposition of dogs almost being like the objects that they're surrounded by in each of these sculptures. Then in the next area, there's sound suits, which is a huge part of Cave's work and what he's known for. So there are these sculptural bodies that started in 1991 but have like continued to evolve over the years within his studio. And there's this idea of masquerade and the hiding of the identity to force one to look without judgment, which hits back on our treatment of objects as well as humans, and the idea of race, gender, and class within viewing these fantastical sculptures. He also, like I said before, focuses on the space, but also the craft and how meticulous it was to put these things together and how that heightens the experience. This is an exhibition that explores the temporary state and seeing into Nick Cave's world. We focus specifically on the soundsuit sculptures. My first response, as well as my group's response to the work, is just how hard it is to rest my eye on one of them, as they're made out of various materials like twigs, found objects, fabrics, beading, as well as other things, but also how encapsulated I can get into not only them as a group, but also as you get closer and seeing the intricacy of the figures and their various identities just based off of what they're made out of and their position. and form. It makes me feel like I'm in a dream, and I'm intrigued to know if these forms have any relation to human identity, which is explained, and there's definitely a correlation between the forms and humans. When looking at them, it makes me think of textile markets that I've come across Europe and this idea of sensory overload. Um, when you see the performance pieces at the end of the exhibit, it really ties together everything, um, because there's an additional sense that is added, which is sound through the movement of the um, sound suits that are static in the room before, but then are put on Nick Cave as well as other dancers and performance art people that he has hired to move and make them come to life as though they are a part of our world. It also reminds me of the work that we studied in this course of Yinka Shanabar, who drew from his memories and experiences like Cave, and found this way of connecting his two worlds of African and Greek written through the Dutch cloth, and its ties to African textiles, but they're actually made in Europe. And he also had a lot of political and social contexts to his um, fabrics that he put onto mannequins that had no heads, which takes the identity away and relates very well to Nick Cave's exploration of masquerade and taking the identity away from the sound suits.
There are a lot of colorful suits in this installation. Each of them is unique. They are all made up of objects such as buttons, beads, flowers, and toys. The artist, Nick Cave, did a great job at balancing the colors throughout the installation. There is a space around each of the sound suits so the viewers are able to see the full sound suit as they walk around the installation. Each of them have their own distinct shape. The texture appears to be different, as some are made with hair, some with cloth, and others with objects. The artist, Nick Cave, used a mold to make the figures' faces, and then he altered them to create individuality. The mood is very happy. The suits are very colorful and bright. I believe he chose to make each sculpture special, to express individuality and show how everyone is unique. He chose to put random objects on the suits to make them useful. I am impressed by how he was able to turn an outfit into something that creates sound by adding different objects to the suits. At a first glance, I thought these suits were used for beauty. They appeared to be created for fashion. The name sound suit made me think that they were created for sound and possibly were used to produce some sort of music.
Nick Cave was born in 1959 in Missouri. This would mean his childhood took place in the 1960s. During this time, many social movements were taking place affecting many minorities, such as LGBTQ, women, and African Americans. The movements which could have affected Cave's art the most were the Civil Rights Movement and the protesting of Jim Crow laws. Cave stated it was a particularly hard time to grow up as a person of color during this point in time. This was likely due to all the social tension around the movements taking place. During the 1970s, Cave would have experienced his preteen and teen years. This is the time that the war on drugs began. This supposed fight to get drugs off the street would turn to being a way to disproportionately incarcerate people of color. Once the war on drugs peaked in the 1980s, Cave was a young adult in college. The war on drugs peaked with the crack epidemic. This is when the proportions of whites and blacks incarcerated became incredibly disproportionate. 80% of persons incarcerated for drug charges were people of color. The chart shows the number of people per 100,000 that were incarcerated for drug charges. The top line is for blacks and the bottom line is for whites, and you can see the very large disproportionate gap that I'm talking about with the war on drugs. This all explains why Cave experienced so much racial profiling in his life. Police began to assume people of color always had drugs on them, so there was a lot of racial profiling, and all of this probably had a really large impact on Cave's art, since these were very tough times in history for people of color.
I believe the sound suits in the installation represents Cave's fantasy world in which everyone is unique. No suits are alike, nor are their positions, directions, and stance the same. It could be this uniqueness solves the problem of categorizing people into minorities and majorities, maybe even absolving biases when there is not a single group to associate them with. Cave has mentioned that instead of not lashing out in rage, he expresses this disdain in something more beautiful. Therefore, I think just the explosion of different colors and designs come from that dark place that he mentions. Nick Cave was taught at an early age about prejudice and discrimination that became apparent during his graduate studies, and he was also racially profiled at one point. Yet he became an accomplished artist through different mediums, and his suits combined together several aspects of his artistic life through dance and fashion. His sound suits were also created as a reaction and response to the 1991 LAPD brutality on Rodney King, and were described as metaphorical suits of armor against the abuse. The art was made for society to be aware of the painful emotions of minorities and their desires to be seen with unbiased eyes. When Cave puts on the suit, the viewer is not aware of his race, gender, nor class, so his art is judged for what it is. Because this art is unusual and doesn't reflect the external world, but rather Nick Cave's emotional experience, I would characterize this art under the aesthetic theory of expressionism.
Overall, Cave's sound suits are profoundly successful manifestations of individualistic identities that are not based off initial reactions to one's race, gender, or class. Further, the suits exist not only as shields from the judgments of society, but also as a commentary on identity and consumerist culture. As well as this, Cave's exhibition Sojourn makes use of what was formerly discarded and elevates forgotten items to a higher status, thus bringing forth the idea of one man's trash is another man's treasure, while also making useful comments on the over-extravagance of American consumerist culture through the use of kitsch imagery. Nick Cave makes use of postmodern artistic principles in his work, in that his forms also come packed with heavy loaded content and commentary. Each work is executed with extreme attention to detail, which helps bring the viewer's attention to subtle visual statements about American culture, race, and consumerism. Throughout the exhibition, there is a sense of the artist's search for protection against a society that constantly barrages its members with unattainable ideals of beauty and wealth. Cave uses this imagery against the original concepts surrounding the objects, original context, and transforms them through the creation of his works.